House of Dragons, the so-called spin-off of Game of Thrones, has a lot to live up to. However, following the abysmal Season 8, Game of Thrones gave up. I'm sure the expectations were low, and if you had the same thought, I don't blame you. After all, it was a truly disappointing ending compared to the first season of this fantastic series. What does House of Dragons have to do with the Game of Thrones? And is it worth watching at a time when there are other similarly matched series airing right now? Can it compensate for all the disappointment we felt with the Game of Thrones? Well, stick around and find out as we go into the House of Dragons and compare it with one of the leading shows with the same theme, The Rings of Power. To start, both Games of Thrones and House of Dragons come from the same man, George R.R. Martin, and that says a lot. Even though the ending to the Game of Thrones was very controversial, we can all agree that the story was top-notch, and that is just precisely what the House of Dragons is based on. The story of the House of Dragons comes from the book Fire and Blood. Unlike the Game of Thrones, the story is more based on fictional history than full-blown novel typewriting, which gives both the watcher and the reader a significantly different experience with the Game of Thrones. The first season of the show was terrific, and this is because you already have a well-written book and the House of Dragons follows it closely, and that makes it much of an interception of the book. When the source material is that good, you can only expect the show to be pretty good. House of Dragons is a lot like the Game of Thrones, but with a smaller and more toned back and light. The source material is already completed and accepted, allowing us to know that they are already working from a finished product that has been well received. Let's compare these two shows, The House of the Dragon and The Rings of Power, and see what makes The House of the Dragon so unique and makes it stand out in the crowd in the multi-million budget production series. The point of making any viewer want to watch something is to form a connection with it and to show the viewer a human or more sensitive side that we can relate to or empathize with. In House of the Dragons, the show focuses mainly on the Targaryen family and the fragile state of the crown. The central storyline is about someone who is supposed to be the rightful heir not getting their place, and the king wanting a son so desperately that he can secure his place on the throne and have a successor. That is understandable, but it's not the same with the daughter, who her father ignores. Although she is beside him all the time and does all the chores, all her father, the king, can think about is having a son and does not pay any attention to his daughter. He even does not notice her presence in the room. However, later on, as the father gets what he wants, he is soon met with a tragic and heartbreaking event where both his wife and the son, the next heir-to-be, dies. Now he has only one option, which is to turn to the girl, and for the first time, he gives her the attention she deserves as she is now his only heir. He proclaims that in a room full of crowd in the Iron Throne, he talks about how he does not want to burden her with such hardships. Still, it is her duty, and now she must not only make for a suitable heir, but also be noticed by other people, mainly her father. However, she struggles to find herself and be seen simultaneously with everything going on. The Rings of Power also has quite a lot to live up to. The movie from which this is a spin-off is genuinely one of the greatest masterpieces ever created, and when you have such high expectations, you better be ready to deliver. Unfortunately, Rings of Power fall short of that. The production quality is admirable, and the background music is brilliant, but it fails to make us connect or form a real-life connection for us to relate to the story's characters. In The Rings of Power, the main story starts with a flashback where we see two siblings, one of whom has to go in search of Sauron to bring him back. He often leaves on his quest and returns empty-handed, and when it all seems like it is all over and is done chasing the Dark Lord, we get to see that Sauron has killed him. They even make sure to put a mark on the body. Hence, people know what happened, but the problem here is that they keep focusing on the fantasy element of the show rather than the human perspective. With the House of Dragons, although there are a lot of fantasy elements in the show, the main focus and the main attraction of the show is, in fact, the characters of the show. We see the king's daughter struggle throughout the show as she struggles to gain the much-needed attention and acknowledgement from her father. While The Rings of Power is more centered around the fantasy themes of elves and the army of Sauron and the main character getting revenge for her fallen brother, the House of Dragons focuses more on its individual characters, but The Rings of Power focus more on the whole story. Moving on from the human connections, let's look at the character development. This is one of those critical ingredients that make us want to watch the show more and keeps us intrigued and relate more with a character. In House of Dragons, we can clearly see the character's personality and the conflict of interests in each of these characters, which eventually leads to fights, mistrusts, and, in specific case, murdering a part of the village population. With the king all busy thinking about having a son, he forgets that he has a daughter and that she even exists, even though she is there in pretty much every scene, and she struggles to make him notice her as his daughter, and that is a conflicting interest here as the king wants a son, but at the same time his daughter wants his attention. As the first episode progresses, he decided to sacrifice his wife to ensure that his son is born. Unfortunately, both the mother and son eventually dies, but he does not inform this to his daughter, and he is concerned whether she might find about it later by herself. In the king's court and in the dining room, all of the king's men has different interests and want to protect their own place in the kingdom while keeping the king happy. The king's brother also wants the Iron Throne. This further complicates the daughter's role in the series. As the story progresses, we see these individual goals come into light more and more as we sense the tension within all these characters as they try to act merry around each other. The Rings of Power again fall short of character development as it all starts with a flashback. We are just thrust upon the story where the main heroine wants revenge. Still, all of her companions want to go back and consult with the king again. Even though this is a conflict between these characters, there is no real backstory as to why there is a conflict between them. Still, the truth is most likely that none of them can keep up with our heroine and wants to go home. Even when she is home, she is asked not to go to war and stay at home by one of her close friends, but this also lacks personal reasoning from the characters themselves, making the plot seem dumb, and what the characters say is not reasoned. All of this makes the House of Dragon better than the Rings of Power. Not only does the House of the Dragon have a great storyline, it drags the viewers in, and let's not forget about that awe-inspiring 2-minute shot where the king, who is now weak, walks into the throne room and sits down on the throne, stating, "I will sit the throne today." The House of the Dragon series offers much more for the viewer to relate to, something that can quickly understand and get a clear picture of what is going on without having to go back and watch the Game of Thrones series. The story is straightforward and full of emotions and passion for their interests, making every episode worth watching.